Alright everyone, tonight we're diving headfirst into architecture, the kind meticulously crafted to endure through wars, plagues, and even those tenants with questionable hygiene habits. So, before you get too comfortable, take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content I'm putting out there. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. Before castles became the romantic, crumbling ruins we see in tourist photos and Netflix dramas, they served a much grimmer purpose. Europe's way of declaring, "We've completely given up on this whole peace thing." After the fall of Rome, civilization took a centuries-long power nap, and the continent devolved into a chaotic free-for-all of raids, revenge, and, let's be honest, some pretty suspect personal hygiene. Anyone with a sword wanted land, and anyone with land desperately wanted walls. Thus, the Motte and Bailey Castle was born. A wooden fort perched atop a man-made hill, all cozily surrounded by a fence, because nothing screams impenetrable defense, quite like slightly elevated lumber. These early forts were cheap to build, quick to assemble, and about as durable as a breadstick left out in the rain. Their greatest enemy was fire, followed closely by wind, and the occasional overly aggressive goose. If a rival lord didn't burn it to the ground, the weather inevitably would. Medieval builders often referred to them as temporary, while raiders more accurately called them kindling. Eventually, someone had the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, buildings designed to withstand attacks shouldn't be quite so flammable. Enter stone, the medieval version of a crucial upgrade patch. Stone didn't burn, didn't rot, and looked intimidating enough to make peasants think twice about asking for a raise. But stone came with a hefty price tag. It was expensive, incredibly heavy, and required a small army of skilled masons, engineers, and, of course, a large number of easily replaceable laborers. Construction could take decades, which was fine because most lords weren't planning on moving anytime soon. And once finished, that imposing stone keep was more than just a fortress. It was the medieval equivalent of posting, "I own this valley, and God probably favors me." The Normans took this concept to Olympic levels. After invading England in 1066, they built castles everywhere. Sometimes it was just to mark territory, sometimes it was purely for the joy of scaring the locals. It's estimated that within a century, there were over 1,000 stone castles dotting the landscape, each one declaring, "Welcome to feudalism, population." Early stone castles were undeniably ugly but undeniably effective. No comfort, no plumbing to speak of, and windows smaller than your phone screen. They were fortresses first, homes second, and damp caves a distant third. But they worked because nothing says "do not invade" quite like a wall thick enough to outlive your grandchildren. The wooden fort had been humanity's hopeful shrug. The stone castle was its grim, magnificent middle finger to would-be invaders. Once the first stone castles began to rise, medieval lords realized something crucial. Safety was nice, but showing off was even better. Building a castle wasn't just about surviving sieges. It was about advertising your superiority in high-definition masonry. Every tower, turret, and portcullis screamed, "I'm richer, smarter, and slightly more paranoid than you." In an age with no Instagram, the only way to flaunt your wealth was to literally carve it into the landscape. You didn't need followers, you needed battlements. Lords competed to outbuild each other, throwing ridiculous sums of money and unpaid labor at their ambitious projects. Castles became less about strategy and more about social status, medieval skyscrapers for men terrified of being irrelevant. The higher your keep, the greater your ego, and nothing said, "I'm untouchable," quite like forcing an entire village to look up at your house every morning while they were out plowing your fields. Feudalism was that simple. The peasants worked, the lord built towers, and everyone pretended it was all God's idea. But don't think every lord was some kind of military genius. Many were just rich men with too much free time and a constant fear of being conquered by someone with better taste. Some built castles in terrible locations, bogs, precarious cliffs, flood zones, purely because they looked dramatic. Function was secondary to aesthetic domination. After all, who cared about access to fresh water when your castle cast an imposing shadow on your neighbor's land? Inside, things weren't much better. Most lords lived in a state of constant anxiety, not from invaders, but from the unsettling realization that their servants knew exactly where the food was kept. They fortified their dining halls, locked their bedchambers, and even invented indoor arrow slits purely out of rampant trust issues. Yet, for all their paranoia, these lords created masterpieces. A single castle could employ hundreds. Masons, carpenters, smiths, and occasionally someone whose sole job was yelling at other people carrying rocks. The design process was brutal. No blueprints, no computers, just pure medieval guesswork and one unlucky apprentice holding a plumb line out in the rain. By the 12th century, the castle wasn't just a fortress. It was the ultimate status symbol. Bigger walls, taller towers, deeper moats, a stone-shaped ego trip that could survive a siege, an earthquake, or even a particularly nasty divorce. And the message was clear. Come for me if you dare. Just remember, my walls have walls. In the Middle Ages, one architectural rule reigned supreme. If you're going to build a castle, put it somewhere annoying. Preferably on a hill, steep, windy, and absolutely miserable to reach. Why? Because gravity, that ancient and unpaid bodyguard, worked best when it was on your side. Every step an attacker took uphill meant less breath, less dignity, and a greater chance of dying before they even saw the front gate. The logic was brilliant in its simplicity. A hill gave you the advantages of visibility, defensibility, and smugness. From up there, you could spot invaders days before they arrived and spend that extra time deciding whether to fight them or just mock them from a safe distance. Lords particularly loved that last part, the ability to point down and say, "You can try, but you'll regret it halfway up." But while it made strategic sense, it was pure suffering for everyone else. The builders hauling tons of stone up treacherous goat paths cursed the day their lord learned about elevation. Supplies had to be dragged uphill by oxen who, by the second trip, were probably reconsidering their evolutionary path. Even the servants hated it. Imagine carrying dinner up 3 terraces, a flight of stairs, and across a drawbridge, only to be told the lord wasn't hungry after all. The aesthetic payoff, though, was undeniable. From below, the castle looked divine, majestic, unreachable, a literal monument to superiority. From above, it was damp, drafty, and perpetually covered in fog. The view was great, assuming you could see past the ever-present clouds sitting on your roof. Not every castle was perched on a perfect hill, of course. Some were built on cliffs because gravity was apparently too subtle of a threat. Others perched precariously on river bends or rocky ridges that were often more dangerous to the occupants than to the enemy. Still, the higher, the better. Medieval lords had an obsession with altitude rivaled only by modern real estate developers. Ultimately, the hill wasn't just for defense. It was a psychological weapon, a daily reminder to every peasant that power lived above them, literally. The castle on the hill wasn't just a fortress. It was a statement. You can see me, you'll never reach me, and if you try, the hill will kill you first. Nothing says keep out quite like a giant ditch full of disappointment. The moat, Europe's most ambitious puddle, became the ultimate accessory for lords who wanted both safety and bragging rights. In theory, it was brilliant. A wide, water-filled trench made it nearly impossible for invaders to reach your walls. Siege towers couldn't cross it, ladders slipped in it, and soldiers sank in it. It was essentially medieval anti-personnel landscaping. In practice, though, it was mostly mud, mosquitoes, and regret. Early moats were rarely the picturesque blue ribbons seen in fairy tales. Most were just deep, filthy trenches filled with stagnant water, dead fish, and whatever the locals accidentally dumped in there. They smelled like divine punishment and looked even worse. But hey, if you were an attacker, that smell alone might make you reconsider your career choices. Not all moats were watery, either. Some were dry, filled with spikes, rocks, or other creatively unpleasant deterrents. A dry moat was cheaper, easier to maintain, and far more likely to break your leg. Medieval engineers loved the idea of enemies falling into a ditch so much that they sometimes built 2. Why stop at one bad idea when you can double down? The real genius of the moat wasn't physical. It was psychological. It told would-be invaders, "You're not even close to my wall, and you're already losing. From across the trench, defenders could safely hurl insults, arrows, and the occasional leftover dinner. It wasn't just defense, it was theater. Of course, moats also came with maintenance problems. They flooded in the rain, froze in the winter, and occasionally drowned the castle's own livestock. Draining them was a nightmare, and if your castle didn't have a nearby river, congratulations, you now had an enormous empty ditch that mocked you every spring. Still, no self-respecting lord would skip a moat. It was the medieval equivalent of a security system, mostly useless, but it made you feel important. And when guests arrived, you could casually mention how bandits never made it past the water, which was technically true because most of them got stuck, lost a boot, and went home ashamed. The moat. A triumph of fear, vanity, and bad drainage. In the medieval world, the gatehouse was the architectural equivalent of a fake smile, polite on the outside, murderous on the inside. It looked like an entrance, but it was really a trap disguised as courtesy. Every castle had one. You'd see it from afar, tall towers, banners flying, drawbridge down, sunlight glinting on stone, and think, wow, what a welcoming sight. 5 minutes later, you'd be lying underneath it, full of arrows and regret. The gatehouse was a masterpiece of defensive psychology. It combined deception, geometry, and gravity in ways only a paranoid medieval architect could truly appreciate. The moment an invading force crossed the drawbridge and entered the tunnel, the trap was sprung. Portcullises dropped, gates slammed shut, and suddenly, congratulations, you were in a stone hallway specifically designed to kill you. Above you were murder holes, charmingly named openings through which defenders could drop rocks, boiling oil, or, on budget days, just anything heavy. On both sides, arrow slits allowed crossbowmen to turn that confined space into a medieval blender. The gatehouse was less an entryway and more an automated shredder powered by human screams. Defenders loved it, attackers hated it, and even couriers probably developed trust issues from delivering mail there. And yet, despite all this brilliance, castle designers couldn't resist overcomplicating things. Some gatehouses had multiple portcullises, just in case the first one wasn't traumatizing enough. Others featured drawbridges over secondary moats, forcing attackers to juggle ladders, siege towers, and their own self-esteem simultaneously. But the best part? The gatehouse also doubled as living quarters for the guards. Yes, the same place where boiling oil occasionally rained from the ceiling was also someone's office. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing that at any moment your ceiling hatch might open and a flaming boulder might roll through. Still, no feature defined the genius of castle design quite like the gatehouse. It was both architecture and theater, a stage where overconfident invaders learned humility and defenders got front-row seats to the carnage. The drawbridge may have said, "Welcome," but the gatehouse always followed up with, "Just kidding." It was the medieval version of customer service, polite until you tried to enter without permission. Nothing in a medieval castle was built by accident, especially the stairs, those narrow, twisting, ankle-breaking nightmares that made you question both gravity and God. They weren't bad design. They were genius cruelty carved into stone. Most castle staircases spiraled clockwise going up. To the average medieval visitor, that meant inconvenience. To a defender, it meant physics with a vendetta. Since most soldiers were right-handed, attackers climbing upward found their sword arms pinned to the central column, while defenders above could swing freely. It was the architectural equivalent of fighting someone in a hallway shaped like a corkscrew. You were doomed before you even started. These weren't comfortable, broad stairs either. Each step was uneven in height and depth, perfect for tripping anyone foolish enough to try running. In peacetime, servants cursed them. In wartime, soldiers died on them. Either way, the builder got his money's worth. And just to add insult to injury, staircases in castles almost always narrowed as they rose. That made it impossible for more than one attacker to climb at a time. Essentially a medieval version of take a number. If you were lucky enough to make it to the top, you were exhausted, dizzy, and already halfway through your life expectancy. Some castles even reversed the spiral direction in different towers just to confuse invaders. Imagine breaching a fortress after days of siege, sprinting up a staircase, and realizing halfway through that your sword no longer fit the geometry. That's not just defense. That's psychological warfare with steps. It wasn't all about combat, though. Spiral staircases were also remarkably space-efficient, tucked into towers and keeps like stone tornadoes. They saved room for more essential things like storage, bedrooms, or, more murder holes. Of course, living with them was less glorious. Lords, servants, and guests climbed these medieval vertigo machines daily, often while carrying food, armor, or chamber pots. Slipping wasn't just embarrassing. It was potentially fatal. Still, the spiral staircase endures as one of the most diabolically clever inventions in history. An elegant blend of mathematics, murder, and inconvenience. In short, it wasn't bad design. It was bad intent. If you've ever toured a castle and wondered why the windows were so tiny, congratulations, you've just spotted the medieval version of a machine gun nest. Those narrow gaps in the wall weren't for sunlight or fresh air. They were arrow slits, and they turned archery into an art form of casual homicide. On the outside, they looked like paper-thin cracks, barely wide enough for a dagger blade. But step inside, and you'd see the brilliance. The slits were wide on the interior, giving archers plenty of room to aim while keeping themselves nearly invisible to the enemy. It was the architectural equivalent of trash talk with no consequences. Attackers could shoot thousands of arrows toward the wall, and 99% of them would just ping harmlessly off the stone. Meanwhile, the defender inside, dry, smug, and slightly underpaid, could calmly return fire with pinpoint precision. It was medieval efficiency at its finest. One man, one slit, and dozens of new ventilation holes in the enemy ranks. And they weren't all simple vertical cuts, either. As siegecraft evolved, so did the slits, cross-shaped openings for crossbows, circular holes for early firearms, and even angled designs for covering specific approach routes. The medieval architect wasn't just building walls. He was designing an interactive experience of despair for invaders. Of course, all this came with side effects. Castles were dark and cold because sunlight was basically outlawed in favor of defense. Inside, you'd bump into walls, furniture, or other people long before you saw them. And when the enemy wasn't attacking, those same arrow slits were just great ways to let in rain and drafts. Still, they worked. A handful of archers could hold off entire armies, protected by geometry and good craftsmanship. It was engineering so effective that some castles used fake arrow slits, just carved into the walls to make the fortress look even deadlier. Nothing says confidence quite like pretending to have more firepower than you do. Arrow slits were simple, silent, and soul-crushingly effective. From the outside, they whispered, "We see you." From the inside, they muttered, "Try your luck." And from a safe distance, everyone else said, "You know what? Maybe we should siege somewhere else." If the castle were a body, the keep was its heart, cold, overbuilt, and constantly under stress. It was the Lord's final refuge, the architectural equivalent of Plan Z. When every other wall had fallen, when the gates were gone, and the moat was now just a communal swamp, the survivors retreated here to wait for salvation or starvation, whichever came first. The keep wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for panic. Thick stone walls, narrow staircases, and doors so heavy they could double as gym equipment. There was no privacy, little warmth, and zero insulation, just echoing corridors and the smell of damp authority. At the top sat the Lord's Tower, where he could look down on both his enemies and his employees, often with the same level of suspicion. These towers were watch points, bedrooms, and existential reminders that absolute power comes with chronic paranoia. Lords would pace along the parapets, muttering about loyalty, while their servants froze 2 floors below. The genius of the keep lay in its simplicity. Everything essential, food, water, weapons, and people you didn't trust, could be crammed inside. If the castle fell, the keep became the last stronghold. Defenders would rain arrows, boiling oil, and creative profanity on anyone who got too close. Some keeps even had trapdoors in the upper floors because gravity, once again, remained the best security system of the Middle Ages. But for all its brilliance, living in the keep was misery disguised as prestige. It was dark, smoky, and cold enough to make penguins file complaints. Fireplaces barely warmed a few feet in front of them, and smoke vented wherever it pleased. By winter, you weren't just defending your castle. You were fighting off frostbite and lung damage. Still, the keep was genius in concept. A single, centralized bunker built long before bunkers were cool. It represented power, endurance, and sheer human stubbornness. Every stone said, "You can kill us, but you'll get tired first." And while lords liked to call them strongholds, everyone inside knew the truth. They weren't fortresses of confidence. They were fortresses of constant anxiety. Because nothing says medieval luxury quite like eating cold stew in a tower while pretending you're not terrified. If the medieval castle had a soul, it was trapped somewhere between the curtain walls, those massive outer defenses that wrapped around everything like a stone hug built by people who didn't believe in hugs. A good curtain wall wasn't just a barrier. It was a psychological statement. It said, "We don't trust you and we're proud of it." Thick, tall, and built with zero mercy. These walls were designed to outlast not just wars, but weather, time, and the Lord's latest financial crisis. The brilliance of the curtain wall lay in its layered defense. Many castles had not one, but two, or even three rings of them. If you broke through the first, congratulations. You were now stuck in what defenders lovingly called the killing zone, an open courtyard designed for maximum regret. Arrows, rocks, boiling water, take your pick. It was the medieval version of a free trial you instantly regretted signing up for. The walls themselves were works of art in misery. Sloped bases made siege engines slide off, rounded corners deflected projectiles, and walkways on top allowed defenders to stroll safely while raining chaos below. Even the spaces between towers were carefully measured, ensuring archers could cover every angle. No blind spots, no mercy, no fun. And while all this looked intimidating, it came at a price. Building curtain walls was painfully slow and ruinously expensive. Quarrying, cutting, hauling, and stacking thousands of stones required years, sometimes decades. Whole generations of peasants lived and died carrying the same wall up the same hill for the same man who taxed them to pay for it. Truly the circle of medieval life. But once complete, the curtain wall turned a castle into a fortress of legend. To an invader, it was hopelessness incarnate, an endless loop of gray stone whispering, "You'll die tired." To the Lord, it was art, the physical manifestation of pride, paranoia, and perfect symmetry. And to everyone else, it was just another reminder that medieval architects were equal parts mathematicians and psychopaths. Because no matter how impressive your siege engine was, the curtain wall always had the last word, and that word was denied. If the castle was the masterpiece of medieval defense, the siege was the messy fan art trying to destroy it. Every wall, tower, and gate inspired new ways to break them, and thus began the most underrated scientific rivalry of the Middle Ages. Engineers versus gravity. Early attackers relied on enthusiasm and bad ideas, mostly ladders. A few brave souls would sprint toward a 40-foot wall, holding what was basically a tree branch, hoping the laws of physics were on vacation. They usually weren't. After enough broken spines, someone finally said, "Let's use math." Enter the trebuchet, the Middle Ages answer to, "What if we built a catapult that could ruin a city's day from half a mile away?" Using counterweights, leverage, and pure spite, these machines could fling 300-pound stones with terrifying accuracy. Entire teams of engineers were devoted to calculating angles, mass, and velocity, turning destruction into geometry homework. Then came the battering ram, which was less scientific but equally expressive. A giant log on chains swung rhythmically against the gate until something, usually the soldiers, gave up first. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine spending years building the perfect door, only to hear it splinter under the weight of medieval teamwork. Defenders, of course, fought back with equal creativity. They poured boiling water, hot sand, or oil from the murder holes, whichever was cheapest that week. Some even built secondary walls inside the first, forcing attackers to start over like a sad historical rerun. But for all their intelligence, medieval siege tactics were also hilariously slow. Some sieges lasted months, others years. Entire armies would camp outside a castle, watching the defenders grow thinner and angrier until both sides simply got bored and signed a truce. In many cases, hunger won before heroism did. Still, every siege taught something new: how to build better walls, stronger bridges, smarter angles. The arms race between stone and science shaped centuries of warfare. It was never about strength alone. It was about who could think faster, aim better, and get the math right before running out of food. And thus, medieval warfare proved what students still know today: math hurts. From the outside, a medieval castle looked majestic: towering walls, fluttering banners, the very image of power. Inside, it was basically a damp refrigerator filled with shouting people and questionable hygiene. Life in a castle wasn't glamorous. It was loud, cold, and perpetually smoky. The walls that stopped catapults also trapped drafts and cooking fumes. Every room smelled faintly of wet stone, with smoke, and the faint despair of everyone who couldn't afford to leave. The grand great hall, where lords feasted and made speeches, was the heart of it all, and by heart, we mean a chaotic, open-concept nightmare. It doubled as a dining room, courtroom, party venue, and occasionally a battlefield. Dogs wandered freely, servants tripped over armor. Someone was always yelling about taxes, and someone else was always asleep under a table. Heat was a luxury. Fireplaces the size of small houses struggled to warm even a few feet of space, while everyone else huddled near the flames, smoking their lungs before winter could finish the job. Windows were tiny slits, good for archery, useless for light. Candles helped, but only if you enjoyed paying a premium for fire hazards. The toilets, or garderobes if you want to sound fancy, were basically holes in the wall with a drop straight down the side of the castle, ingenious for the time, horrifying by any modern standard. Some emptied directly into the moats, turning your defensive water feature into a biological weapon. The smell alone could repel armies. Food was abundant, but rarely appetizing. Fresh meat was for nobles. Everyone else got whatever could be boiled beyond recognition. Bread doubled as plates, which then doubled as compost. Okay, I understand. Here's the translation and rewrite of the provided text into American English, with the interpret and clarify style, and allowing for slight expansion, 10 to 20%, for enhanced clarity. Here we go. Okay, picture this medieval dentistry. Brutal, right? Yet, despite the sheer misery, people felt a strange sense of pride in calling the castle home. To the outside world, it stood as a powerful symbol of privilege, a fortress promising safety and security. But inside those imposing walls, it represented something else entirely: survival through sheer, stubborn endurance. You toughed it out, enduring the biting cold, pretending not to notice the scurrying rats, and convincing yourself that the constant dripping from the ceiling was simply ambience. And yet, for all its very obvious flaws, the castle was the beating heart of medieval life, a stark monument to both paranoia and the human capacity to endure. Kept you alive even as it slowly, inevitably, drove you a little bit mad. Living within a fortress meant embracing a certain reality. You were safe, undoubtedly uncomfortable, and probably mildly smoky from the perpetually smoldering fires. But hey, at least you weren't dead. Castles weren't just fortresses. They were constant, looming reminders. Massive, immovable, and impossible to ignore, every single stone seemed to whisper the same, stark message. Someone richer than you lives here, and he owns everything you can see stretching out before you. For the lords and kings who commissioned them, castles weren't merely built to defend territory. They were built to control it absolutely. You didn't need to send out patrols along every road when your intimidating fortress sat on the horizon like a divine threat, a constant presence. It was the medieval equivalent of an influencer's coveted blue check mark: public, highly visible, and just a little bit insufferable. Each castle served as the physical embodiment of authority. The peasants dutifully plowed the fields beneath its shadow. The merchants reliably paid their taxes because of it. And the local priest, while probably harboring some resentment, likely blessed it nonetheless. The walls weren't just about defense. They were carefully crafted instruments of propaganda. The underlying message was crystal clear: obedience guarantees safety. Rebellion equals certain suicide. Everything about castle architecture relentlessly reinforced this rigid hierarchy. The Lord's Chamber was always perched high above everyone else, ostensibly for defensive purposes, but let's be honest, mostly for ego. Guests had to climb seemingly endless flights of stairs before being granted an audience, a design ensuring they arrived physically exhausted and emotionally subdued. Even the layout of the Great Hall was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The Lord elevated at the far end, the peasants relegated below, all illuminated by smoky torches that subtly cast everyone in a slightly guilty light. The architecture also cleverly served a crucial social function: surveillance. From the lofty battlements, guards could keep a watchful eye on every field, every road, and occasionally, every questionable decision made by the villagers. If someone dared to contemplate rebellion, the castle would see it first. If anyone tried to flee the Lord's domain, the castle would watch them fail in real time. It was medieval security, just without the convenience of cameras, relying instead on people who were paid to never, ever blink. For the common folk, the castle loomed over their daily existence like a silent, stone god. They built it, supplied it, and lived in constant fear of it, all while fully aware that they would likely never set foot inside unless something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. To the Lord, the castle was home, a symbol of his power. To everyone else, it was an ever-present threat that never slept. And yet, in its cold, imposing brilliance, the castle achieved exactly what it was designed to do: maintain peace through intimidation, ensure loyalty through fear, and establish order through carefully calculated architecture. It wasn't just a building. It was feudalism carved into granite. But by the late Middle Ages, castles had arguably done their job a little too well. Then gunpowder arrived on the scene. Cannons suddenly made those once impregnable walls seem woefully inadequate, and those proud, imposing fortresses looked less like invincible strongholds and more like ridiculously expensive rock collections. So, the nobility did what the nobility has always done throughout history. When practicality takes a nosedive, they redecorated. The once impenetrable castle slowly evolved into something new entirely. Part palace, part status symbol, and part overcompensating family heirloom. Thick walls were no longer needed to repel trebuchets, so architects gleefully filled them with luxury, or at least the medieval approximation of it. Think opulent curtains, plush carpets, and windows that actually opened. The horror. Defensive towers were transformed into lavish bedrooms. Moats morphed into manicured gardens. Arrow slits were widened into scenic viewing points, a bold design choice that would have made earlier generations of lords physically ill. Where boiling oil was once poured onto hapless invaders, now imported wine flowed freely. What was once a grim fortress became a flamboyant fashion statement. The new buzzword was comfort. Central fireplaces spread warmth instead of choking smoke. Tapestries covered cold stone walls, partly for insulation, but mostly to subtly remind guests that their host could afford someone else's elaborate needlework. Kitchens grew exponentially bigger, not to feed armies, but to roast peacocks for elaborate dinner parties. The feudal age of fear was gradually being replaced by the Renaissance age of conspicuous showing off. Of course, some lords simply couldn't quite let go of tradition. They still built mock battlements and installed fake arrow slits. Not for actual defense, mind you, but purely for aesthetic intimidation. After all, nothing screams wealth quite like a purely decorative murder hole. These castles were less about actually surviving a siege and more about surviving the relentless scrutiny of social judgment. By the 15th century, the castle had officially retired from the rigors of warfare and joined the world of architecture as historic luxury housing. It became the medieval equivalent of a ridiculously expensive sports car. Totally unnecessary, outrageously flashy, and primarily intended for impressing people you secretly despised. But there was a certain undeniable genius in this evolution. The medieval castle, born from chaos and fear, had cleverly reinvented itself as a work of art. No longer a fortress of war, it now became a fortress of refined taste. It stood proudly as a monument to humanity's favorite pastime, transforming mere survival into high style. And while the cannons roared menacingly outside the castle walls, inside, The lords were far too preoccupied with debating the perfect tapestry color schemes to even notice. For nearly 5 centuries, castles had been Europe's ultimate, unbreakable insurance policy. Stone giants laughing at ladders and sneering at cumbersome siege towers. Then, one fateful day, someone rolled up with a cannon and essentially said, "Try me." Gunpowder changed absolutely everything. Those thick, glorious walls that had effortlessly deflected rocks and arrows for generations suddenly folded like stale bread. What used to require months, or even years, of arduous siege could now be accomplished in an afternoon. Given enough gunpowder and, admittedly, a healthy dose of optimism. Medieval warfare evolved almost overnight. And castles, once the ultimate defensive invention, went out of style faster than chainmail underwear. The irony was brutal. The stronger the castle, the louder it exploded when finally breached. Builders had spent centuries meticulously perfecting the principles of geometry and gravity, and now both gleefully betrayed them. Cannonballs turned unwavering pride into scattered rubble, imposing towers into mere confetti, and keeps into nothing more than smoking echoes of, well, that escalated quickly. Lords desperately tried to adapt to this terrifying new reality. They lowered walls, widened moats, and built earthen ramparts in a futile attempt to absorb the devastating blasts. But by the 16th century, the writing was quite literally on the wall, and the wall was very definitely on the ground. The age of stone had given way to the dawning age of science. As castles crumbled and fell, opulent palaces began to rise in their place. The thinking was simple. If you couldn't reliably defend your wealth, you might as well brazenly flaunt it. Architects traded gloomy battlements for elegant balconies, narrow arrow slits for dazzling stained-glass windows, and cumbersome drawbridges for purely decorative fountains. Power was no longer measured in impregnable fortifications. It was measured in the shimmering glow of chandeliers. The feudal lord was gradually replaced by the well-lit bureaucrat. The old castles, once roaring with soldiers and thick with the acrid smell of smoke, slowly turned into silent, haunting ruins, poignant monuments to both paranoia and exceptional craftsmanship. Some became grim prisons, others peaceful monasteries, and many simply crumbled into picturesque tourist attractions. Peasants who had once trembled in fear at their looming shadows now casually picnicked in their abandoned courtyards. The fall of the castle wasn't a failure of design, however. It was a triumph of progress. Humanity had simply outgrown its crude, stone cages. Cannons didn't just put an end to sieges. They brought an entire era to a definitive close. And yet, even in utter ruin, castles stubbornly refused to vanish from the landscape. They lingered like proud ghosts of an age that steadfastly refused to be forgotten. Because even when you blow them sky high, you still inevitably look up at the remaining remnants. That's the enduring power of a castle. It never truly falls. It simply waits patiently for the next century to admire it. The castles may have fallen silent, but their stones never truly stop talking. Centuries after their builders turned to dust, the walls still stand, cracked, mossy, and somehow smug about it all. They've resolutely survived wars, kings, throngs of tourists, and even the occasional misguided teenager armed with spray paint. Not bad, really, for buildings originally designed by people who genuinely considered bathing to be a highly suspicious activity. The legacy of castles extends far beyond mere military history. It's profoundly psychological. They essentially taught Europe how to think in stone. Every towering wall was a carefully crafted lesson in patience. Every imposing tower, a stark statement of fear subtly disguised as unwavering confidence. They weren't simply fortresses. They were extended therapy sessions for an anxious civilization. Even in their ruined state, they still command a certain undeniable respect. Stand inside one today, beneath the cold archways, amongst the narrow arrow slits and echoing halls, and you can feel it. The sheer weight of human paranoia, relentless ambition, and meticulous craftsmanship pressing down on you. It's as if history itself is whispering with a chilling certainty, "You absolutely would have died here." Modern architects still readily borrow from their timeless designs. Symmetry, grandeur, imposing vertical dominance. Skyscrapers are basically just castles that have discovered the wonders of glass. Corporate headquarters, too, are often essentially fortresses built not so much to defend, but to intimidate. The same primal instincts that shaped medieval battlements now subtly shape the design of gleaming office towers. Keep the power firmly inside. Keep everyone else firmly out. But beyond all the symbolism, castles endure because they capture something profoundly primal. The fundamental human need to build something lasting that unequivocally declares, "I was here." Lords, peasants, humble masons. All of them chasing a form of immortality. One carefully laid stone at a time. Every brick was a defiant act against the relentless march of time. An ambitious attempt to outlast the very chaos that inspired its construction. And, against all odds, it somehow worked. Today, they serve as picturesque backdrops for weddings, immersive settings for video games, and dramatic subjects for slow-motion drone footage. Repurposed relics of human stubbornness. We romanticize them, selectively remembering the past as inherently noble and conveniently forgetting that those drafty rooms were anything but charming. But the truth is far simpler. Castles weren't magical. They were utterly necessary. And in their very necessity, they became strangely beautiful. So, as the wind howls through the crumbling towers and tourists eagerly snap selfies where terrified knights once panicked, always remember this. Castles were never really about perfection. They were about survival dressed up as art. They were fear meticulously transformed into architecture. And in their powerful silence, they remind us of something we consistently seem to forget. That even the strongest walls will eventually crumble, but the enduring ideas behind them, well, those never truly die. When people hear the words Roman orgy, they conjure images of rooms overflowing with excess, rivers of wine spilling, music echoing endlessly, and everyone completely losing control. But the truth, as is so often the case, is far less wild and far more political. Much of what we picture today doesn't come from first-hand accounts, but rather from the biased pens of moralists, satirists, and Rome's many political enemies. To them, publicly accusing an emperor of scandalous indecency was the ancient equivalent of a thoroughly modern smear campaign. The Roman word convivium simply meant a banquet, a formal dinner where the elite gathered to eat, engage in spirited debate, and forge crucial alliances. These meals could certainly be lavish, yes, but by no means were all of them scandalous. The ancient historian Pliny, for example, described dinners that ended relatively early, characterized by measured drinking and intellectual conversation. Only at the very uppermost echelons of society did some feasts occasionally cross over into outright spectacle. The modern idea of a Roman orgy, as later imagined, was largely an exaggeration, often deliberately designed to make powerful figures seem corrupt, decadent, or fundamentally unfit to rule. Writers like Suetonius and Tacitus certainly described the darker sides of certain emperors. Caligula's unpredictable cruelty, Nero's penchant for dramatic performances, and Elagabalus's obsessive love of ritual excess. But even these accounts should be read with a healthy dose of skepticism. These authors frequently served senatorial audiences who often deeply despised the very emperors they were describing. If Caligula, for example, invited nobles to a private feast, it could easily be reported as a night of unspeakable sin, whether that was actually true or not. In ancient Rome, perception was often a weapon far sharper than any sword. That's certainly not to suggest that Roman feasts were somehow innocent, however. They were carefully staged displays of power. A host's immense wealth was ostentatiously displayed through imported delicacies. Flamingo tongues, freshly caught sea urchins, or exquisitely honeyed dormice. Guests typically reclined on plush couches. Slaves silently served wine and talented musicians performed. Yet beneath the heady perfumes and the seemingly endless laughter, every single conversation was carefully choreographed political theater. Friendships were strategically negotiated, alliances were subtly forged, and rivalries were openly exposed. Pleasure, in this specific context, became just another highly effective form of influence. Over time, later cultures, particularly during the rise of the Christian era, eagerly used tales of decadent Roman orgies as cautionary moral warnings. They became enduring symbols of pagan corruption, not objective historical accounts. The sensational legend of endless debauchery stuck, primarily because it proved so incredibly useful. It allowed for the seemingly effortless explanation of the eventual fall of Rome as a form of divine punishment for unbridled excess. In reality, most Romans saw restraint, not indulgence, as the true ideal. What we often remember as wild abandon was, in reality, likely just highly exaggerated gossip originating from a civilization that was utterly obsessed with appearances, relentless ambition, and the incredibly fragile dance between fleeting reputation and deep-seated desire. Every Roman banquet, from the grandest imperial feast to the humblest senator's dinner, was, in essence, a performance. A silent war fought with subtle glances, careful gestures, and strategically placed goblets. To be invited was both a distinct privilege and a demanding test. The host subtly displayed his power not through explicit words, but through carefully curated extravagance. From the gleaming marble floors to the rare imported spices, every painstakingly chosen detail seemed to whisper the same, undeniable message. I am wealthier, more cultured, and far more connected than you could ever hope to be. For the elite, food was a potent political weapon. A skillfully timed dinner could easily secure vital loyalty, effectively silence a troublesome enemy, or overtly showcase imperial favor. The closer your designated couch was to the host, the higher your social standing invariably became. A particularly bad seat, or even worse, the complete absence of an invitation, could easily end a promising career. Roman etiquette was notoriously merciless. Cicero once famously complained that being served lukewarm wine was a blatant personal insult. The dining room, known as the triclinium, wasn't merely a place to eat. It was a meticulously designed theater of dominance. Wine, the ultimate symbol of Roman sophistication, flowed freely, but it also carried a distinct undercurrent of danger. Too much could easily loosen carefully guarded tongues and reveal dangerous secrets. A witty toast could earn rapturous applause. A clumsy one could irreparably destroy a fragile reputation. Roman elites were perpetually expected to strike a delicate balance between pleasurable indulgence and strict decorum, carefully displaying immense wealth without ever losing control. That precarious tightrope walk ultimately defined the true Roman ideal. Luxury always tempered by unwavering discipline. Elaborate entertainment was also an integral part of the overall strategy. Skilled poets recited captivating verses, graceful dancers performed, and sometimes exotic animals or professionally trained jesters amused the assembled guests. But it wasn't all just laughter and light-hearted revelry. Senators whispered discreetly about pending legislation, powerful generals traded strategic favors, and bitter rivals subtly undermined each other through barbed jokes thinly disguised as compliments. In a society utterly obsessed with rigid hierarchy, a single banquet could easily determine who would rise and who would ultimately fall. Yet behind all the carefully manufactured glamour, the stark reality of pervasive inequality was impossible to ignore. While the privileged aristocracy reclined comfortably on plush silk cushions, enslaved individuals stood silently motionless for hours, endlessly pouring wine or meticulously wiping up spills. For them, a lavish banquet wasn't a celebration. It was unremitting servitude. Still, the obvious efficiency and elegance of their service directly reflected on their master's prestige. Even the unwavering composure of the slaves themselves was yet another carefully calculated aspect of the host's carefully constructed image. The Roman banquet, then, was never simply about food or superficial pleasure. It was a complex ritual of calculated control, a carefully staged arena where alliances were forged, and bright futures were destroyed without a single sword ever being drawn. Each toast, each course, and each fleeting glance carried the immense weight of relentless ambition, barely suppressed desire, and the never-ending struggle for survival within the empire's glittering web of power. For Rome's ruling class, pleasure wasn't merely a casual indulgence. It was a highly refined form of performance art. To dine extravagantly was, in essence, to emphatically announce your undisputed place among the powerful. Emperors, senators, and wealthy patrons alike all fully understood that their carefully cultivated reputations were built not just in the bustling forum, but also around the meticulously set table. Here, The art of lavish feasting seamlessly blended with the subtle art of sophisticated manipulation. Every seemingly insignificant detail of a Roman banquet spoke volumes. The precise cut of a guest's tunic, the extreme rarity of the dishes being served, and even the specific fragrance of the subtly burning incense all hinted at both immense influence and refined sophistication. A clever host could artfully use these carefully selected elements to send coded messages, deftly demonstrating both immense wealth and disciplined restraint, unbridled generosity and absolute control. True sophistication lay in carefully knowing precisely how far to push the boundaries. Appear too modest and you risked being perceived as inherently weak. Become too lavish and whispers of moral decadence could easily spread through the city like wildfire. Nero, for example, initially mastered this delicate balance with apparent ease, until he most definitely didn't. At first, his lavish feasts dazzled all of Rome with their innovative music, captivating poetry, and breathtaking innovation. He eagerly encouraged artistic display and surrounded himself with the city's most brilliant creative elite. But as his personal paranoia inexorably grew, his banquets slowly turned theatrical in the very worst possible way. Guests lived in perpetual fear that one wrong word, or one ill-considered gesture, could easily turn an evening of supposed pleasure into a public humiliation, or, even worse, a horrific death sentence. Pleasure under Nero became mere performance under constant threat, where genuine laughter was replaced by forced smiles, and sincere loyalty was cynically measured in forced applause. For the Roman elite, even seemingly intimate acts carried significant political meaning. A carefully placed affair or a strategically whispered rumor could shift crucial alliances far faster than any law ever could. Women of noble birth, often casually dismissed by male historians, played absolutely crucial roles at these gatherings. Their inherent influence, natural charm, and keen intelligence could easily elevate their families, or just as easily ruin their most hated rivals. Behind all the gleaming polished silver trays and flowing wine, Rome's complex social machinery was constantly in motion, subtle, incredibly dangerous, and endlessly calculating. Yet this widespread obsession with carefully cultivated image was not purely cynical. Many Romans genuinely saw pleasure as a valid pathway to a deeper divine connection. To fully experience joy, embrace beauty, and appreciate abundance was to directly honor the very gods who generously provided them. The convivial convivium wasn't just a simple party. It was a carefully constructed reflection of cosmic order, where fundamental harmony, balanced restraint, and abundant wealth all symbolized a prosperous and powerful empire. Still, the ever-shifting line between the sacred and the sinful blurred all too easily. For every discerning guest who eagerly sought refinement, there was always another who desperately sought reckless escape. In those dimly lit, candle-lit rooms, surrounded by both laughter and immense power, Rome's greatest virtue, iron self-control, was perpetually at war with its deepest, most alluring temptation, unrestrained excess. When Gaius Caesar, better known to history as the infamous Caligula, rose to power, Rome confidently expected yet another Caesar Augustus, a capable restorer of stability and order after years of relentless political intrigue. Instead, they got a ruler whose banquets quickly became infamous symbols of absolute madness and outrageous extravagance. But beneath all the scandalous rumors and lurid exaggerations, Caligula's carefully orchestrated feasts reveal just how the manipulative Roman elite skillfully used pleasure as a potent form of political theater, and how absolute power could easily twist casual entertainment into terrifying intimidation. Caligula's dinners were never simple meals. They were carefully calculated performances, deliberately meant to display his unquestionable divine authority. Guests cautiously reclined beneath glittering gilded ceilings while exotic perfumes filled the air. Fountains flowed freely with expensive wine and dishes filled with the rarest delicacies. Peacock brains, flamingo tongues, and lustrous pearls carefully dissolved in vinegar graced the tables. Every single bite screamed of excessive indulgence, but it was also cleverly crafted propaganda. Caligula desperately wanted his wary guests to see him not as a mere mortal emperor, but as a god among men. The carefully staged spectacle subtly reminded them that he directly controlled not just the empire's immense wealth, but also their very comfort and well-being. Ancient sources such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio meticulously painted these scenes as outright debauchery, but their underlying motives were undeniably political. Both wrote their sensational accounts long after Caligula's untimely death, eagerly serving skeptical senatorial audiences who were eager to vilify ambitious tyrants. What they casually dismissed as blatant immorality may have often been little more than theatrical arrogance. A brash young emperor deliberately mocking the rigid stiffness of Rome's deeply entrenched traditions. Still, there's simply no denying that his lavish feasts often carried an undercurrent of barely concealed menace. It was often said that he brazenly invited senators' wives and openly mocked their humiliated husbands, deliberately blurring the already thin boundary between gracious hospitality and calculated humiliation. For those present, every single toast was a subtle test of unwavering loyalty. To casually refuse a specific dish or to hesitate in lavishly praising his carefully crafted performance risked severe offense. To flatter too eagerly risked outright ridicule. Survival required the meticulous precision of a gifted poet and the uncomplaining patience of an overworked slave. Many quietly left the emperor's imposing table outwardly smiling, while inwardly trembling with barely suppressed fear. Behind all the forced laughter and carefully chosen words, Rome's complex power structure was ruthlessly on full display. The lavish feast was Caligula's carefully constructed stage, and everyone else was simply an actor forced to participate in his cruel, divine farce. By strictly controlling indulgence, he effectively controlled fear, and by brazenly mocking established virtue, he casually reminded the wary Senate that he stood far above their limited judgment. Whether or not every lurid rumor was actually true, Caligula's flamboyant banquets marked a clear turning point in Roman culture. They transformed the convivium from an elegant gathering of brilliant minds into a vivid living metaphor for pervasive imperial corruption, where pleasure, politics, and deep-seated paranoia mixed like wine and deadly poison in the same deceptively beautiful golden cup. If Caligula skillfully turned the Roman banquet into a dangerous weapon, Nero skillfully turned it into a meticulously crafted stage. No other emperor in Roman history ever blurred the already hazy lines between refined art and unrestrained appetite so completely. He genuinely fancied himself a gifted performer, a brilliant poet, and a visionary ahead of his time. His lavish feasts weren't just about elaborate food. They were painstakingly crafted spectacles, where assembled guests became both captive audience and carefully chosen props in his grand, self-directed drama. Nero's ostentatious banquets often began with breathtaking theatricality. Intimate rooms shimmered with the flickering light of countless candles reflecting off carefully gilded ceilings. Perfumed flower petals drifted gently from hidden openings, while highly skilled musicians played mesmerizing music as the privileged guests casually reclined on couches crafted from the finest ivory and solid silver. The vain emperor himself frequently performed, singing, playing the lyre, or boldly reciting elaborate verses that he claimed to have spontaneously written in a moment of divine inspiration. The true delicacies at these extravagant nights were never the exotic dishes themselves, but Nero's insatiable need for constant admiration and lavish praise. But even these glittering gatherings were never without an undercurrent of palpable unease. The astute historian Tacitus keenly observed that wary guests dared not look even remotely bored, for even the slightest hint of indifference could easily be interpreted as a grave insult. Unreserved applause was, quite literally, survival. Some particularly memorable feasts reportedly lasted from dusk until dawn, punctuated by endless courses of rich and decadent foods. Expertly roasted swan, exquisitely honeyed dormice, and plump oysters imported from distant, exotic provinces. Slaves hurried silently through the vast halls carrying more wine than an entire army could possibly consume, and even the very air was heavy with the lingering scent of rare spices imported from faraway Arabia. It was pure indulgence elevated to high-performance art. But it most definitely came at a very steep cost. For Nero, spectacle was undeniably politics. By relentlessly dazzling the elite, he eagerly sought to constantly remind them that his personal creativity and inherent generosity were simply unmatched. Yet the more extravagantly he performed, the more detached from reality he ultimately became. His glittering banquets mirrored the empire itself. Seemingly magnificent, outrageously excessive, and slowly cracking beneath its own immense weight. When a devastating famine struck Rome, these extravagant feasts suddenly took on a much darker and far more sinister meaning. The understandably outraged public now saw them not as refined art, but as cruel mockery. Even the infamous Domus Aurea, his opulent golden house, perfectly reflected this fundamental contradiction. It contained intricately designed dining rooms that slowly rotated like the heavens themselves, a potent symbol of undeniable divine luxury. But while the ornate ceilings turned serenely above him, the empire's collective patience slowly ran out far below. His flamboyant feasts, once admired for their innovation, slowly became potent symbols of a detached ruler utterly lost in his own self-indulgent fantasy. In the end, Nero's tragic downfall was just as theatrical as his turbulent reign. The very man who had so casually treated life as one long, unending banquet ultimately found himself utterly abandoned by those who had once eagerly cheered his every performance. His enduring legacy ultimately reminds us just how easily true beauty can devolve into unrestrained excess, and how a fervent love of art, when twisted by unchecked ego, can slowly devour the artist himself. If Nero brazenly blurred the existing line between art and unrestrained indulgence, the flamboyant Elagabalus simply erased it entirely. Crowned emperor at the incredibly young age of just 14, he brought to Rome a unique brand of flamboyant spirituality that utterly shocked the rigid establishment. As the high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, he saw absolutely no division between dedicated worship and unbridled pleasure. To him, lavish feasting was a sacred ritual, one that seamlessly blended ardent devotion, raw desire, and dramatic spectacle until absolutely no one could reliably tell where true holiness actually ended and casual hedonism gleefully began. His extravagant banquets quickly became the stuff of wild legend. Ancient writers claimed that assembled guests dined on such incredibly exotic dishes that even seasoned nobles were utterly stunned into stunned silence. Camel heels, delicately spiced ostrich brains, and lustrous pearls casually dissolved in pungent vinegar. Cascades of fragrant flower petals literally rained down from the high ceiling in such utter abundance that some unfortunate guests reportedly suffocated beneath them. A gruesome tale that was likely wildly exaggerated, but far too striking to ever be fully forgotten. Elagabalus utterly adored shocking the conservative elite. He would pointedly seat the most prudish and conservative senators right next to scantily clad performers, battle-hardened soldiers, and exotic foreign priests, casually turning Rome's otherwise rigid hierarchy into a chaotic and thoroughly uncensored carnival. But beneath all the apparent absurdity was a strange kind of governing philosophy. Elagabalus genuinely believed that raw pleasure itself could actually be inherently divine. By actively surrounding himself with incredible beauty, inspiring art, and overwhelming sensation, he convinced himself that he was truly honoring the benevolent gods who had initially created them. His opulent feasts, then, weren't simply acts of unrestrained excess. They were genuine performances of profound cosmic unity. Unfortunately for him, Rome was absolutely not ready for such flamboyant and unconventional devotion. What he saw as profound religious ecstasy, his understandably skeptical subjects saw as rank madness. His blatant disregard for deeply ingrained Roman tradition went far deeper than mere cuisine. He defiantly replaced Jupiter's sacred statues with those of his own deity, married multiple times in quick succession, and casually invited both women and eunuchs to hold influential positions of power. To the increasingly wary and conservative senators, these blatant acts were quite simply unthinkable. His extravagant banquets quickly became shorthand for pervasive chaos. An emperor who was far too young, far too foreign, and far too reckless to responsibly rule. The ceaseless gossip that inevitably surrounded him, outrageous stories of bizarre meals and wildly inappropriate behavior, was far less about food itself than it was about growing fear. Rome understandably feared what it simply didn't understand. Elagabalus's rapid downfall came just as swiftly as his equally rapid rise to power. In 222 CE, the once loyal Praetorian Guard abruptly turned against him, definitively ending both his chaotic reign and his infamous feasts of reckless fantasy. Yet his scandalous legend has resolutely endured through the long centuries. For centuries, Writers have eagerly used his infamous name to vividly symbolize unchecked decadence pushed to the very brink of stark insanity. But perhaps, just perhaps, behind all the wildly exaggerated tales, Elagabalus was simply a deeply misguided dreamer, a boy emperor who naively mistook divine celebration for unquestionable divine right, and whose unwavering pursuit of transcendent beauty ultimately led him straight into the unforgiving depths of absolute oblivion. For centuries, the salacious tales of ancient Rome's decadent orgies have captivated the popular imagination. But carefully separating casual gossip from the actual truth inevitably reveals a remarkably different picture. Most of what we confidently think we definitively know about Roman debauchery originates from the biased pens of historians who were writing long after the actual events themselves. Men with distinct agendas, carefully chosen biases, and very specific moral lessons to clearly teach. They certainly weren't objective eyewitnesses to these purported wild parties. They were instead highly opinionated commentators selectively framing Rome's inevitable decline as a suitable punishment for their alleged moral decay. Writers such as the often cynical Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio frequently used scandal as a compelling literary device. When an emperor inevitably fell out of popular favor, wild accusations of flagrant gluttony, unbridled lust, or outright cruelty predictably followed. It was, in essence, the ancient equivalent of a highly modern character assassination. By selectively painting influential figures like Caligula, Nero, or Elagabalus as inherently depraved, these shrewd historians conveniently reassured their wary readers that Rome's ever-present crises were ultimately the fault of deeply flawed individuals, and not the fault of the entire overarching system itself. It was always easier and infinitely more convenient to directly blame specific lavish feasts than to seriously question the complexities of entrenched politics. Archaeology, however, tells a much quieter, far more nuanced story. Ongoing excavations of opulent villas in both Pompeii and Herculaneum reveal elegantly designed dining rooms carefully built for both comfort and engaging conversation, and certainly not for wanton chaos. Beautiful frescoes show relaxed guests casually reclining in small, intimate groups attended by discreet musicians and silent servants, but definitely not scenes of uncontrolled indulgence. Exquisite tableware discovered in elite homes, fine glass, polished bronze, and gleaming silver, suggests refined elegance, and not chaotic disorder. These were indeed spaces of sophistication, where good taste and proper behavior were just as important as the food itself. This isn't to say excess was entirely absent. Roman elites reveled in luxury and were fiercely competitive. They amassed spices from Arabia, silks from China, and wines from far-flung provinces. However, such indulgence was intended to showcase refinement, not to be seen as a vice. The aim was to project culture and generosity, not to cause a neighborhood scandal. In reality, Roman banquets more closely resembled a modern diplomatic dinner than some hedonistic fantasy. The confusion partly arises from translation issues. The Greek word orior originally described sacred rites, religious ceremonies that incorporated music, dance, and emotional expression. When early Christian writers adopted the term, they warped its meaning into something sinful. By the Middle Ages, Roman orgy became a shorthand for corruption, completely divorced from its original sense. In truth, Roman feasting was an intricate social ritual, part political maneuvering, part spiritual observance, and part artistic expression. The sensational stories endure because they cater to our fascination with shock and stark moral contrasts. However, the evidence suggests something more nuanced. A culture preoccupied not with chaos, but with control, image, and the delicate balance between pleasure and power. After the fall of the Roman Empire, tales of its supposed decadence didn't disappear. They simply evolved. Early Christian writers, eager to contrast the purity of their faith with perceived pagan excess, transformed the idea of Roman orgies into a potent moral lesson. What had once been political propaganda became spiritual symbolism. Rome fell, they claimed, because it was consumed by sin. The banquet table became an altar of corruption. Writers like St. Augustine and later medieval chroniclers depicted the empire's decline as divine retribution. They portrayed emperors as consumed by lust, greed, and vanity, using them as proof that paganism could only lead to ruin. These weren't historical accounts, but rather sermons. The exaggerated tales of naked feasts, drunken senators, and immoral rituals served as allegories for temptation and the perils of straying from faith. In the Christian imagination, the Roman banquet wasn't about food at all. It was about the soul's craving for discipline. This reinterpretation shaped the empire's image for centuries. In medieval manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, Rome was reborn as a city of sin, its emperors serving as cautionary figures for kings and nobles throughout history. Caligula became the embodiment of pride, Nero the symbol of vanity, and Elagabalus the epitome of blasphemy. The historical complexities of politics and performance were erased, replaced by spectacle vivid, moralistic, and unforgettable. By the time Enlightenment scholars re-examined ancient sources, the damage was done. The phrase Roman orgy no longer referred to a banquet. It signified moral collapse. Artists and playwrights from France to England capitalized on this mythology, filling stages with togas, goblets, and scandalous behavior. Painters like Thomas Couture and Jean-Léon Gérôme revived images of drunken emperors and decaying morals, giving visual form to centuries of exaggeration. Yet, this transformation tells us more about later societies than about ancient Rome itself. Each era projected its own anxieties onto the empire's ruins, anxieties about wealth, temptation, and the fragility of civilization. To the Victorians, Rome symbolized what could happen if moral restraint failed. To modern audiences, it represents the allure of forbidden pleasures. Thus, the myth of the Roman orgy survived not because it was true, but because it served a purpose. It became a mirror through which each generation could examine its own desires and hypocrisies, all while pretending to merely observe the past. By the time the myth of the Roman orgy reached modern ears, it had passed through nearly 2 millennia of distortion. What began as political rumor and moral storytelling had become a cultural shorthand for decadence. Yet, the truth of Roman feasting lies somewhere between ritual and ruin, a world where beauty, ceremony, and excess coexisted in a fragile harmony. In ancient Rome, banquets were more than just about satisfying appetites. They were microcosms of the empire itself, hierarchical, theatrical, and deeply symbolic. Each guest, each course, and each sip of wine reflected the delicate balance between chaos and order that defined Roman life. Pleasure wasn't condemned. It was celebrated, but within boundaries. To eat and drink well was to honor the gods, one's ancestors, and the prosperity of Rome. Even the most lavish feasts were governed by etiquette, structure, and meaning. Yet, that balance was constantly at risk. When emperors like Caligula or Nero crossed the line between elegance and spectacle, their banquets became metaphors for the empire's own instability. Power transformed ritual into farce. What began as harmony devolved into hubris, and hubris demanded punishment. The feast became an omen, a reminder that unchecked indulgence could devour even the mightiest civilization. Still, not all was decay. The Roman world gave rise to extraordinary culinary innovations, artistic refinement, and architectural grandeur. Dining rooms were adorned with mosaics depicting myth and nature. Music and poetry filled the air. To dine in Rome was to participate in a total artistic experience, where taste, sound, and scent merged into a single cultural statement. Even the humblest citizen aspired to emulate the elegance of the elite, at least in spirit. The ideal Roman sought temperantia, the virtue of balance. It was this principle, not chaos, that defined the core of their identity. Over the centuries, the myth of endless indulgence obscured that truth. The orgy became a convenient symbol of decline, overshadowing the sophistication beneath the surface. In reality, Roman feasting was both a celebration of life and a cautionary tale about excess, a mirror reflecting the best and worst of human nature. In the end, perhaps the legend endures because it feels timeless. Every civilization, from ancient Rome to our own, must grapple with the same question. When does pleasure become peril? And when does abundance lead to its own downfall? In the 10th century, far from the deserts of Baghdad, the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan encountered Norse traders known as the Rus, Amidst the clamor of iron, fur, and amber along the Volga River, he noticed something striking, not their weapons or ships, but the women who stood among them. He wrote that these Viking women were adorned from the tips of their fingers to their necks with dark blue and green markings. To him, they seemed both mysterious and regal, bearing stories etched into their skin. These markings were more than mere decoration. In Norse culture, identity and faith were so intertwined that the body itself became a living testament to both. A tattoo could declare one's lineage, devotion, or power, much like a saga told without words. Lines wound around arms like runic prayers. Spirals across the chest resembled the turning of the seasons or the spinning of fate. For Viking women, these designs likely reflected not vanity, but a sense of belonging to a clan, to a god, to the ancient rhythms of survival. The colors Ibn Fadlan described were also significant. The deep blue ink, likely made from ash, soot, or crushed copper salts, symbolized endurance and divinity. In Norse myth, blue was the color of ice and wisdom, associated with Odin's all-seeing eye and the eternal northern sky. To wear that hue was to wear a fragment of the world itself, to let one's flesh mirror the vastness of creation. The green tones may have been linked to fertility, growth, or the goddess Freya, protector of women, love, and beauty. Archaeological evidence is scarce, since skin rarely survives the centuries. Yet, fragments of tattooing tools, pigment stones, and carved combs suggest the practice was real and likely widespread. In Viking burials, scholars have found symbols carved into wood and metal that echo the same patterns described by Ibn Fadlan: loops, vines, and serpents devouring their own tails. These designs, whether on skin or stone, conveyed one message: that life and death were interwoven in an unbroken circle. To the Norse, beauty was not fragile. It was fierce. And for their women, these tattoos were not acts of rebellion or vanity. They were declarations of faith, memory, and endurance, marks of identity that would outlast even the snow and the centuries. To the Vikings, the body was not a blank canvas. It was a message. Every scar, braid, and bead told a story, and tattoos were the most permanent of all. For Viking women, body art functioned as both ornament and oath. It was how they carried the unseen heritage, protection, and emotion into the visible world. A tattoo could mark a woman's ancestry as clearly as a family crest. In a culture where oral history replaced written records, the skin became a living archive. A winding line across the wrist might represent a family's voyage across the sea. A knot around the neck could symbolize eternal loyalty to kin. These designs were not random. They were storytelling through geometry, where every twist echoed myths of fate and rebirth. The placement of tattoos held meaning, too. Hands and forearms, always visible during work or trade, displayed strength and skill. Necklines were intimate, reserved for symbols of faith or love, perhaps a rune for Thor's hammer, or an intertwined serpent to invoke the Midgard serpent. Some scholars suggest that certain designs might have been linked to rites of passage, coming of age, marriage, childbirth, or even mourning. A Viking woman's tattoos could thus trace the milestones of her life like chapters in a personal saga. Runes often formed part of these designs. The rune Algis, shaped like an upturned Y, represented protection, a spiritual shield against harm. Fehu signified wealth and prosperity, while Berkana, shaped like a birch leaf, stood for fertility and renewal. To ink these symbols was to invite their power, merging the physical and spiritual worlds. Tattooing itself was likely a ritual act. The process involved piercing the skin with soot or charcoal, perhaps mixed with oils or plant resin. It was not casual decoration. It was endurance transformed into devotion. A woman who chose ink also chose pain, and in Viking belief, pain had purpose. It connected the body to sacrifice, echoing Odin's own self-wounding on the world tree to gain wisdom. So when Ibn Fadlan saw those deep blue patterns shimmering against pale northern skin, he wasn't just witnessing art. He was seeing faith made flesh. Each mark was a whisper of belonging, a vow written in blood and ash, surviving long after the voice that spoke it had fallen silent beneath the snow. In the world of the Vikings, faith wasn't confined to temples or carved idols. It lived in everyday gestures, charms, and symbols etched into the skin. For Viking women, tattoos often carried spiritual weight, serving as both prayer and protection. Each design, no matter how small, was believed to guard the wearer against unseen dangers, disease, betrayal, ill fortune, or death at sea. Their ink was not vanity. It was armor. The Norse believed that the world was a dangerous weave of fate and chaos. Beneath every sunrise lurked the threat of cold, hunger, and loss. A tattoo then became a quiet act of defiance, a promise that one's spirit would not be swallowed by winter or war. Many designs borrowed directly from Norse mythology. A coiled serpent symbolized Jormungandr, the world serpent who encircled the earth, representing protection through eternal vigilance. A web-like pattern might recall the Norns, the three sisters who spun every life's destiny from birth to death. To wear such marks was to carry divine acknowledgement upon the skin. Some Viking women were known to invoke specific gods through tattoo motifs. Freya, goddess of fertility and love, might be represented by falcons or cats, her sacred animals. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, appeared as a rune or charm against evil forces. Odin's symbols, especially the Voknut, 3 interlocked triangles, were worn by those seeking wisdom, courage, or a peaceful death. These weren't mere decorations. They were prayers written in a language of lines and pain. The act of tattooing itself had ritual significance. A woman receiving a sacred mark might fast, chant, or call upon her ancestors during the process. The ink, often mixed from soot, ash, or crushed minerals, was seen as alchemical, binding body and spirit. It was said that a mark given in devotion was not just on the skin, but in the soul. Such symbols also protected in life's most vulnerable moments: childbirth, travel, and mourning. To carry protective ink was to walk with invisible guardians, reminders that the gods watched even in silence. In this sense, a Viking woman's tattoos were not for display. They were a pact, a promise between mortal and divine that faith, when carved in flesh, could never truly fade, even when the body returned to the earth. Tattooing in the Viking world was not a simple craft. It was a sacred art. Those who practiced it were more than artisans. They were keepers of stories and symbols, trusted to inscribe meaning onto the body with precision and reverence. Though their names have long since vanished from history, their influence lingers in the inked legends passed down through Ibn Fadlan's account and Norse myth alike. A Viking tattooist likely held a role somewhere between a healer, a priest, and a smith. The process itself required courage, both from the artist and the subject, with needles made from sharpened bone or bronze and pigments drawn from soot, ash, or natural dyes. Each mark was tapped carefully into the skin. There was rhythm to the act, a quiet ritual that echoed the hammering of gods and craftsmen. The slow sting of ink became part of the initiation, a symbolic trial of endurance and transformation. Tattooing was usually done in domestic or ceremonial spaces, often accompanied by chanting, storytelling, or offerings. Some scholars believe these sessions took place during significant festivals like Yule or Midsummer, when the veil between the human and divine was thinnest. To receive ink during such moments meant becoming part of something larger, a living participant in the sacred cycles of Norse belief. The designs themselves reflected the deep connection between art and survival. Patterns often resembled those carved into longships, jewelry, and wooden beams, uniting the body with the objects that defined Viking life. Spiral motifs symbolized continuity and rebirth. Runic inscriptions bound the wearer to gods or ancestors. For women, these tattoos were not hidden. They were displayed proudly on visible parts of the body: the hands, arms, and neck, announcing strength, beauty, and faith without a single word. Even trade may have carried the art of tattooing across borders. The Vikings' vast network stretched from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the warm markets of Constantinople. Along the way, they encountered the tattooing traditions of Slavic, Turkic, and Arabic cultures, perhaps blending techniques and symbols. Through these exchanges, Norse tattooing evolved into a reflection of a cosmopolitan world, one where identity, faith, and artistry met at the tip of a needle. Each tattooist, though nameless, left behind a silent legacy, a belief that stories are best told not only in words, but in skin that endures. If Viking tattoos spoke a language, their alphabet was the rune. These angular symbols carried power beyond mere letters. They were bridges between the human and the divine. To carve or ink a rune was not simply writing. It was invocation. Each one held meaning, purpose, and consequence. For Viking women, runes etched into the skin could bless, protect, or even curse, depending on intent. The runic system most associated with the Viking Age was the Younger Futhark, a simplified version of the older script used across Northern Europe. Unlike our modern alphabet, each rune represented both a sound and a concept, a cosmic truth bound to nature or the gods. Fehu meant wealth, not just material but spiritual abundance. Algiz symbolized protection, like the spreading antlers of an elk shielding from danger. Berkana embodied fertility, motherhood, and new beginnings, while Tawaz, shaped like an arrow, represented justice and sacrifice, honoring the god Tyr. To inscribe a rune onto the body was an act of faith. A woman who bore Berkana upon her wrist might be invoking safe childbirth. Another with Algiz along her forearm might trust it to guard her on journeys across icy seas. These symbols were not chosen lightly. They demanded respect, for each stroke was believed to echo through the unseen worlds. In Norse lore, even Odin himself bled to learn the secrets of the runes, hanging from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights until the knowledge revealed itself. To tattoo them then was to mimic the god's sacrifice in miniature, to suffer briefly for wisdom and power. Runes also served as social markers. Among traders, they could signal allegiance to a clan or faith. Among healers, they symbolized the binding of energies, warding off illness or ill luck. Women often bore combinations of runes, forming protective charms like the binding runes found in later Scandinavian artifacts. These complex designs intertwined letters into shapes resembling vines or snowflakes, beautiful yet potent. Though few physical traces of these tattoos survive, carved stones, jewelry, and wooden relics suggest their visual vocabulary. Across time, the runes whispered the same message, that ink could do what words could not. It could bind fate to flesh. For Viking women, each mark was a spell, each symbol a story, and their bodies were the manuscripts of eternity. Not all Viking tattoos were made for war or worship. Some were born from the quiet ache of love and memory. In a world where death was constant and separation inevitable, tattoos offered a rare kind of permanence. For Viking women whose husbands, fathers, or sons might vanish at sea or in foreign lands, the ink beneath their skin became a promise that love would endure even when flesh and bone did not. Archaeologists and historians have long speculated that certain tattoo motifs mirrored the emotional bonds within Norse society. A knotwork pattern could symbolize eternal union, its endless loops reflecting the belief that souls intertwined across lifetimes. Twin birds, perhaps ravens or swans, might represent lovers divided by distance, one flying over the waves while the other waited beneath the northern sky. A simple line winding from the wrist to the heart could signify fidelity, a mark known only to the one who bore it. The Norse concept of love was not soft or sentimental. It was fierce, loyal, and tragic. The sagas are filled with women who waited decades for a warrior's return or swore vengeance for a slain husband. Tattoos became quiet extensions of those vows. Some may have carried runes invoking Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, while others bore the sign of Odin's ravens, linking affection to memory and wisdom. Inking these symbols was both prayer and protest, an act of devotion against the inevitability of loss. Death, too, was never far from love in Viking life. When someone passed, women often took part in mourning rituals that included symbolic offerings or markings. It's possible that tattoos were renewed or added during these rites, transforming grief into remembrance. The pain of the needle mirrored the pain of loss, binding the emotional wound into the physical one, so that both could heal, scar, and remain. To the Vikings, love was as sacred as battle and as binding as an oath. Their tattoos, even the smallest, carried that same weight. Each mark whispered of longing, loyalty, and remembrance, of a love that refused to fade with the sun or with the years. In a culture that feared being forgotten above all else, to tattoo love was to make it eternal. While sagas often glorify Viking warriors, the truth is that many Norse women were merchants, travelers, and negotiators, carrying their culture far beyond Scandinavia. Some historians believe their tattoos reflected this reality. Symbols of trade, prosperity, and worldly connection inked into their skin. These marks weren't just ornaments. They were credentials, signs of identity in a vast and often perilous trading world. The Viking Age stretched across continents, from the icy fjords of Norway to the bustling markets of Baghdad, Constantinople, and the Caspian Sea. Women frequently joined or even led trading expeditions, managing the exchange of furs, amber, iron, and slaves. In such encounters, tattoos could act as both conversation and currency. They communicated one's origin, beliefs, and reliability without a single word. A merchant woman adorned in blue ink was instantly recognizable. A traveler from the far north whose people valued courage and honor. The designs that accompanied these journeys often carried runic blessings for safe passage and fortune. Symbols of ships, waves, and spirals evoked the sea, the lifeline of Viking prosperity. Some patterns mimicked the carved figureheads of longships, believed to ward off evil spirits lurking in the mist. The spiral etched on the hand might represent both the turning of the tides and the cyclical nature of wealth. What is risked returns. Cultural exchange also left its imprint. As Viking traders interacted with Arabic, Persian, and Turkic artisans, new aesthetics entered their repertoire. Geometric motifs and flowing script found their way into Nordic art, just as Norse knotwork fascinated foreign observers. It is possible that Ibn Fadlan's famous account reflects this cross-pollination, a fusion of northern mysticism with Eastern craftsmanship. For Viking women, these marks may also have carried social and spiritual meaning. A trader's tattoo could symbolize not only economic ambition, but divine favor, invoking Jord, god of the sea and wealth, or Freya, patroness of prosperity and fate. Every journey was dangerous. Storms, raiders, and betrayal lurked on every horizon. To bear sacred ink was to carry invisible protection. Thus, the merchant's tattoos told a dual story of commerce and courage, profit and piety. They marked not only where a woman came from, but how far she was willing to go. Beneath her skin flowed the map of an empire built not by conquest alone, but by ink, salt, and trade. Though much of what we imagine about Viking tattoos comes from trade and domestic life, there's another side to the story, the marks of warriors and wanderers. Norse women were not confined to hearth and hall. Some joined raids, defended settlements, or accompanied their kin on voyages across unknown seas. For them, tattoos became symbols of endurance, strength, and identity in a life where survival itself was an art. The sagas hint at women like Lager, the legendary shield maiden who fought beside men with ferocity and cunning. Whether real or mythic, such figures embodied the Norse ideal of balance, beauty and brutality, wisdom and wrath. Tattoos may have mirrored that duality. A spiral around the arm could signify the cycle of battle and rebirth, while a wolf's head on the shoulder evoked Odin's warriors, the unstoppable Ulfnar and the fearless berserkers. Unlike the decorative patterns of merchants or artisans, warrior tattoos carried ritual intent. Before battle, women might ink or renew protective runes. Tawaz for courage, Algiz for defense, or Soilo for victory and guidance by the sun. The ink itself was often made from soot and ash taken from sacred fires or burnt weapons, making the tattoo both physical mark and spiritual talisman. To wear it was to bind oneself to fate, Wyrd, the invisible thread of destiny the Norns wove for all mortals. Voyagers, too, bore their stories in ink. A woman who had crossed the Baltic or journeyed to the east might mark her skin with the sails of a longship or the silhouette of a raven, the messenger of Odin, symbol of intelligence and navigation. For her, tattoos were records of passage and proof of experience. Every mark etched on her body was both a compass and a confession. She had seen the world and lived to return. When Ibn Fadlan met Norse traders along the Volga, perhaps he wasn't seeing merchants alone, but survivors of such voyages, women who carried the ocean's memory on their skin. Their tattoos were not acts of rebellion, nor ornaments of vanity. They were declarations of presence. To be marked was to be known, to be. They aspired to be counted among the living, those who had stared into the abyss of chaos and emerged stronger, more resilient. In that respect, their ink served as their shield, a silent, sacred testament to their indomitable spirit, as unwavering as the northern sea itself. Time may have erased the tangible ink from Viking skin, but the profound meaning behind it endures. The bodies that once proudly displayed those deep blue patterns have long since returned to dust. Yet, the stories persist, passed down through the writings of travelers, unearthed artifacts, and the lingering echoes of northern myths. While archaeology cannot resurrect the tattooed flesh of the past, the tools, symbols, and sagas left behind offer undeniable evidence that these markings were far more than mere vanity. They were a visible declaration of identity, a tangible manifestation of deeply held beliefs. In the frozen Scandinavian soil, archaeologists have discovered fragments of needles, pigment stones, and mixing bowls, all pointing to a widespread and sophisticated tattooing culture. Patterns meticulously carved into combs, jewelry, and wooden boxes mirror the very designs described by Ibn Fadlan in his accounts. Even in regions far removed from the Viking homelands, Russia, Scotland, and Iceland, these same symbols reappear, forging connections across time and sea through shared artistry and cultural heritage. The absence of preserved skin only deepens the allure and mystery, inviting the imagination to trace the lines that once flowed from finger to neck, telling silent stories of courage and belonging. Today, modern descendants and historians are passionately rediscovering this rich tradition, reviving the ancient Nordic ink as a powerful means of reconnecting with their ancestry. Tattoo artists meticulously study runestones, intricate jewelry, and evocative saga poetry to recreate what might have adorned those ancient men and women. Each line drawn today is both an homage and a hypothesis, a delicate bridge spanning modern curiosity and ancestral pride. What was once seemingly lost to the annals of history has triumphantly returned as a vibrant expression of cultural identity reborn. But perhaps the true and enduring legacy of Viking tattoos lies not merely in the intricate patterns themselves, but in the profound philosophy they embodied. To the Norse, every life was a thread meticulously woven into the grand tapestry of fate, and every act, from the careful carving of wood to the deliberate marking of skin, wove that thread deeper into the fabric of eternity. Their tattoos served as a constant reminder that beauty could harmoniously coexist with pain, that courage could be both quiet and fierce, and that meaning was not something passively inherited, but something one had to actively create and earn. In Fadlan's brief yet insightful description, we glimpse far more than a mere observation. We are offered a glimpse into an entire worldview. Those blue marks, now rendered invisible by the passage of time, once boldly told stories of unwavering faith, enduring family bonds, and the will to survive against all odds. They were, in essence, prayers written in pigment, proof that even in the coldest and most unforgiving corners of the world, humans relentlessly sought to make their souls visible, to leave an indelible mark on the world. And though the ink itself may have faded, the powerful message still lingers, echoing through the ages. To be remembered, one must first choose to be seen, to step out of the shadows and embrace one's own unique identity. When King Gentius ascended the Illyrian throne around 181 B.C.E., he became the ruler of a kingdom that was both fiercely proud and inherently precarious. The Illyrians, comprised of fierce and independent tribes scattered along the rugged Adriatic coast, had stubbornly resisted centuries of domination from stronger and more organized neighbors. They were warriors, traders, and skilled pirates, their formidable ships commanding the strategic straits between Greece and Italy. However, by the time Gentius rose to power, the Illyrian kingdom found itself surrounded by ambitious giants. Macedon loomed to the east, Rome advanced from the west, and restless Greek states stirred to the south. The world had grown smaller, and these powerful empires hungered for complete control of the Adriatic Sea, a vital artery of trade and military movement. Gentius was the son of Pleuratus, a king who had previously maintained a fragile peace with Rome. Yet, the young ruler possessed a markedly different temperament, sharper, more ambitious, and far less inclined to bow to foreign influence. From his capital at Skadra, modern Shkodër, Albania, Gentius embarked on a bold mission to unify the disparate Illyrian tribes into a single, disciplined power capable of effectively resisting both Greek intrigue and Roman expansion. To the Illyrians, he represented a potent symbol of defiance, an intelligent and fiercely proud monarch determined to preserve his nation, which was precariously wedged between these burgeoning empires. However, his position was fraught with inherent tension and danger. The ever-watchful Romans scrutinized his every move, never forgetting earlier Illyrian kings who had dared to defy their authority and challenge their dominance. Simultaneously, Greek states, particularly the kingdom of Perseus of Macedon, actively courted Gentius with enticing promises of a powerful alliance against the growing Roman threat. Caught squarely between these two formidable forces, the Illyrian king faced a perilous and fateful choice: to cautiously bend to Roman diplomacy and accept their veiled dominance, or to place his trust in Macedonian steel and risk a direct confrontation with the Republic. Ultimately, Gentius chose the path of resistance. He immediately began strengthening the Illyrian navy and reorganizing his land forces, imposing tighter control over the often fractious tribes and strategic coastal cities. His rule was both admired and feared, his justice consistently harsh but undeniably fair. Contemporary Greek accounts describe him as a clever but also cruel monarch, a ruler whose ambition often outpaced his caution and strategic planning. Yet, beneath that seemingly cold exterior lay the unwavering determination of a leader who resolutely refused to allow Illyria to become just another Roman province without a fight, without exhausting every possible avenue of resistance. Still, ominous dark clouds continued to gather ominously over Skadra. Trade faltered dramatically under increasing Roman pressure, and alliances with other regional powers proved to be notoriously fickle and unreliable. What had initially begun as a promising reign of unity and consolidation slowly devolved into a desperate struggle for sheer survival. Gentius would soon tragically discover that the most dangerous enemies of Illyria were not solely across the sea, but lurked insidiously within his own borders, among those he thought were loyal. His crown, once a shining symbol of hope and national pride, was rapidly becoming a target in a deadly game that no Illyrian king could realistically hope to win against the might of Rome. As Gentius tightened his grip over Illyria, his small realm became the last independent bulwark standing defiantly between the expanding empires of Rome and Macedonia, two powerful forces destined for an inevitable and cataclysmic collision. The rugged Adriatic coast was far more than just a stretch of rocky land. It was a vital crossroads of trade, strategic importance, and ultimately, survival. To the ever-pragmatic Romans, Illyria represented a nagging problem that stubbornly refused to simply disappear. To the Macedonians, it was a potentially valuable ally in their increasingly desperate bid to halt Rome's relentless domination of the strategic Balkans. And to Gentius, it was simply home, a land he was prepared to defend and would not surrender without a fierce and bloody fight. The early years of his reign were carefully marked by cautious and calculated diplomacy. Gentius outwardly maintained formal peace with Rome, even dispatching envoys to the Senate in a show of good faith, reassuring them that Illyria had no intention of interfering in Roman affairs. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed facade of calm, he was diligently rebuilding and strengthening his kingdom. He significantly expanded his fleet, strategically stationed garrisons along the Drine River, and forged fragile alliances with tribal leaders who had long resisted centralized authority. The Illyrian king's grand vision was clear and ambitious: to create a united and formidable kingdom strong enough to effectively defend itself without having to subserviently bow to either empire. But Gentius's far-reaching ambitions inevitably aroused suspicion and distrust. Roman merchants began lodging official complaints about escalating piracy in the Adriatic Sea, acts that Rome conveniently blamed on Illyrian captains supposedly loyal to Skadra, despite a lack of concrete evidence. The Senate, never one to forgive any semblance of independence or defiance, began diligently gathering excuses for potential intervention, meticulously building a legal and political case for future action. Meanwhile, Gentius found a willing partner in Perseus of Macedon, the last Antigonid king desperately fighting his own war of survival against Rome's encroaching power. Their alliance was one born primarily out of necessity, not genuine trust or long-term strategic alignment. Perseus desperately needed a diversion to the north to draw Roman forces away from Greece, while Gentius urgently needed Macedonian gold and reliable military backing to bolster his defenses. The alliance, however, was inherently fragile from its very inception. Greek states already under Roman influence vehemently denounced it as reckless and dangerous, while even within Illyria, influential chieftains questioned the wisdom of needlessly angering the greatest power in the Mediterranean world. Still, Gentius remained steadfast in his belief that a strong alliance with Macedonia offered the only realistic hope of preserving Illyrian sovereignty in the face of overwhelming odds. For a brief and fleeting moment, the Adriatic Sea seemed to tremble with the distant echoes of Illyrian war drums. Ships were swiftly readied for battle, and Roman envoys dispatched stern warnings to Scadra, demanding an immediate cessation of hostilities. Gentius famously dismissed these threats, reportedly telling his war council, "Let Rome cross the mountains, they will not return." However, across the sea, the inexorable Roman legions were already mobilizing. Rome had decisively crushed Carthage and effectively subdued Greece. Now it turned its unwavering gaze towards Illyria, the last free kingdom standing between the seemingly unstoppable empire and its total domination. Gentius had made his fateful choice, and there was no turning back from the impending storm. By 170 BCE, Illyria stood precariously at a critical crossroads, and King Gentius made what would prove to be his most consequential decision: a formal alliance with Perseus of Macedon, the last direct descendant of Alexander the Great's once mighty dynasty. The two beleaguered rulers shared a singular goal: to halt Rome's relentless march across the Balkans and preserve their own kingdoms. But their ill-fated partnership, born primarily of desperation, would soon tragically reveal just how fragile hope could be when balanced precariously against Roman discipline, wealth, and cunning. Initially, the alliance appeared promising on the surface. Perseus dispatched envoys to Scadra bearing lavish gifts, substantial amounts of gold, fine cloth, and alluring promises of shared glory and mutual benefit. Gentius saw in Macedonia a mirror of Illyria's own precarious plight, a proud and independent kingdom, fiercely embattled and increasingly surrounded by Roman ambition. The core agreement was deceptively simple. Illyria would launch aggressive attacks against Roman allies in the region, disrupting their vital supply lines and diverting their attention, while Perseus would directly confront the Roman legions in Greece. If successful, both kingdoms could potentially restore genuine autonomy to the lands Rome relentlessly sought to claim as its own. However, there was a critical catch that would ultimately prove disastrous. Perseus, ever the cautious and calculating ruler, deliberately withheld full payment of the promised funds, delaying crucial support until Gentius had definitively proven his loyalty and commitment to the alliance. This fateful hesitation would have devastating consequences. The Illyrian king, increasingly pressured by dwindling resources and growing internal dissent, felt compelled to take aggressive action unilaterally, imprisoning Roman envoys sent to Scadra to negotiate a peaceful resolution. That single act, whether driven by genuine anger, strategic desperation, or a fatal miscalculation, effectively sealed his fate and triggered Rome's wrath. In the eyes of the Roman Senate, it was tantamount to an outright declaration of war. Perseus, too, hesitated fatally. His armies remained firmly entrenched in Greece, passively waiting for Rome to spread itself too thin and overextend its supply lines. But the Romans were quicker, far richer, and infinitely more organized than either Gentius or Perseus had anticipated. They promptly dispatched Lucius Anicius Gallus, a highly skilled and ruthless commander, to swiftly subdue Illyria before Perseus could effectively react or offer any meaningful assistance. Within mere weeks, Roman legions were relentlessly advancing up the Illyrian coast, decisively cutting through Illyrian defenses with chilling precision and efficiency. Gentius had fatally overestimated the capabilities and commitment of his Macedonian ally, while simultaneously underestimating the overwhelming power and resolve of his Roman enemy. He sincerely believed that Perseus would swiftly march north to meet him and reinforce his defenses, but tragically, no help ever arrived. What had initially begun as a pact of supposed equals now quickly looked like a cruel abandonment. Illyrian soldiers fought bravely and tenaciously, but they were ultimately outnumbered and outmatched by the superior Roman discipline, equipment, and logistical support. As Scadra grimly prepared for a prolonged siege, tension and fear gripped the king's court. Whispers spread rapidly that Macedon had treacherously betrayed them, that gold had been generously promised but would never be delivered, and that their cause was already lost. For Gentius, the alliance that was initially meant to preserve Illyria's independence and sovereignty now stood as the fatal mistake that would inevitably lead to its destruction. And as the ominous Roman banners ominously appeared on the horizon, the young king's unwavering faith in diplomacy tragically gave way to the grim resolve of a man bracing himself for his final, desperate stand. By 168 BCE, the storm that Gentius had long and anxiously feared finally broke with devastating force. The seasoned Roman general Lucius Anicius Gallus, leading a formidable force comprised of battle-hardened legions and well-equipped allied troops, crossed into Illyria with ruthless efficiency and determination. What the Illyrian king had hoped would be a prolonged war of attrition and determined resistance quickly devolved into a swift and decisive lightning campaign that shattered Illyrian defenses. Within less than a month, the Romans systematically dismantled the last vestiges of the once proud Illyrian kingdom piece by piece. Gentius desperately mustered his remaining troops at Scadra, the royal capital nestled strategically between protective mountains and winding rivers that had long shielded Illyria from foreign invasion. His warriors, hardened tribesmen adept at sea raids and fierce hill battles, fought with commendable bravery, but Rome's well-oiled machine of conquest proved utterly unstoppable. Roman soldiers advanced in tight, impenetrable formations, Roman engineers skillfully built bridges across treacherous rivers, and Roman supply lines remained unbroken, ensuring a constant flow of resources. For every Illyrian stronghold relentlessly captured, Rome strategically left behind garrisons and imposing banners, a silent yet unmistakable declaration that Illyria no longer belonged to its own people. As the seemingly invincible Romans approached, smaller Illyrian tribes began surrendering en masse, hoping to curry favor and receive mercy from the advancing legions. Their loyalty to Gentius wavered and ultimately crumbled under the immense weight of Rome's overwhelming power. Even worse, his wavering Greek allies began deserting him, abandoning their pledges of support. Perseus of Macedon, now effectively cornered in Greece, sent no reinforcements, and the promised gold to fund Gentius's army never materialized, leaving Illyria exposed and vulnerable. Betrayed and increasingly isolated, the Illyrian king now stood almost entirely alone against the might of Rome. The final, desperate stand occurred at Scadra, where Gentius made one last valiant attempt to rally his people and inspire them to resist the invaders. His loyal wife, Queen Etuda, and his steadfast brother Caravantius remained resolutely by his side as Roman forces completely surrounded the city. For days, skilled Illyrian archers rained down a storm of arrows upon the advancing enemy, their defiant shouts echoing through the valley. But hunger and despair soon replaced defiance, gnawing away at the defenders' will to fight. The rivers that had once guarded Scadra now effectively trapped it, cutting off vital supplies and reinforcements. The Illyrians, renowned for their resilience, could not possibly endure the siege forever against the vastly superior forces arrayed against them. When the gates of Scadra finally creaked open, Gentius met the Roman envoy not as a proud warrior, but as a defeated and captive king. According to Polybius, he surrendered with an air of quiet dignity, still wearing his royal robes, yet resolutely refusing to kneel before his captors. The Romans, although impressed by his stoicism, remained unmoved by his plight, swiftly seizing his treasury, his fleet, and his family. Illyria was decisively broken. The once proud kingdom that had ruled the Adriatic, that had defied empires and built impressive cities of stone, was no more. With Gentius's capture, the storied line of Illyrian kings came to an abrupt end, and with it, the sovereignty of a people who had ruled the mountains and seas for centuries. After the siege of Scadra, King Gentius, along with his queen Etuda and their children, were taken as prisoners by the Romans. The victorious conqueror Lucius Anicius Gallus treated them with a degree of formal courtesy, a calculated gesture reserved for fallen royalty. But beneath that thin veneer of civility lay the bitter sting of humiliation and utter defeat. The Illyrian king, who had once commanded formidable fleets across the Adriatic, was now reduced to a mere trophy of war, paraded before jeering crowds to showcase Rome's unparalleled supremacy. Gentius and his family were sent first to Corcyra, modern Corfu, and then transported across the Ionian Sea to the heart of Italy. The journey itself was a carefully orchestrated spectacle. Roman ships, their decks lined with disciplined soldiers, carried the royal captives as irrefutable living proof that Illyria had indeed fallen. Along the coasts, towns cheered their arrival, not out of genuine respect, but out of morbid curiosity. A defeated king was a rare and thrilling sight, meticulously staged for maximum impact. For Gentius, every wave that crashed against the hull of the ship was a painful reminder of how swiftly fortune could turn against even the most powerful crown. In Rome, the Senate jubilantly celebrated yet another swift conquest. The Illyrian campaign had lasted a mere 30 days, a remarkable victory that definitively demonstrated the unmatched might and efficiency of the Roman Republic. Gentius was forced to appear in the triumph of Anicius Gallus, walking in chains through the streets of the capital as huge crowds jeered and mocked him. Ancient writers noted his stoic composure during this ordeal. He did not plead for mercy, nor did he cry out in anguish. There was still a palpable air of pride even in defeat, though it must have burned within him like a searing iron. Following the triumph, Gentius and his family were sent to Spoletium, modern Spoleto, in central Italy, where they lived under strict house arrest. For a man born to rule and accustomed to absolute power, confinement was a slow and agonizing death. Yet, some historical sources hint that the Romans treated him with a certain degree of guarded respect, recognizing in him not just a rebellious enemy, but a fallen monarch who had fought bravely. His younger brother, Caravantius, who had fought valiantly beside him, was imprisoned as well, his fate likely mirroring that of the king, captivity until death. The Illyrian crown, meanwhile, was systematically dismantled piece by piece. Roman administrators divided the conquered land into manageable districts, disarming the once fierce tribes and taxing the bustling ports that had once filled Gentius's coffers. Scadra, once the proud capital of a kingdom, was reduced to a mere provincial outpost within the ever-expanding Roman dominion. From the grandeur of kingship to the stifling silence of captivity, Gentius's tragic story reflected the devastating fate of his people. Proud, resilient, but ultimately consumed by Rome's relentless expansion. His throne was irrevocably gone, but his defiant spirit, meticulously recorded even by his enemies, ensured that his name would not entirely vanish from the pages of history. With Gentius imprisoned and Illyria thoroughly subdued, Rome moved swiftly and decisively to erase the last lingering traces of independence from the once proud kingdom. What had begun as a punitive military campaign swiftly transformed into the systematic dismantling of all Illyrian power structures. The Senate strategically divided the captured territory into manageable administrative regions, each directly governed by Roman officials or by local chieftains who had wisely surrendered early and pledged their allegiance to Rome. The underlying purpose was clear and unambiguous: to ensure that no Illyrian king would ever rise again to challenge Roman authority. The formidable Illyrian navy, once feared throughout the Adriatic for its swift Liburnian ships that raided Greek and Italian coasts, was either burned to ashes or seized and incorporated into the Roman fleet. Strategic ports such as Lissus, Scadra, and Rhizon, once bustling with traders, warriors, and vibrant commercial activity, were transformed into Roman outposts, firmly controlled by Roman garrisons. The Adriatic Sea, once proudly called Mare Illyricum, now served primarily as a Roman highway, facilitating trade, troop movements, and the projection of Roman power. The Illyrian people, who had effectively controlled these vital waters for centuries, were gradually reduced to subjects within a vast and foreign empire. Rome's swift victory also served a clear political purpose, sending a chilling message across the entire Mediterranean. Resistance against Roman power was ultimately futile. Neighboring tribes and wavering Greek city-states, carefully watching the rapid fall of Scadra, began to proactively pledge their loyalty to Rome without engaging in any further resistance. Even Perseus of Macedon, Gentius's ill-fated ally who had abandoned him to his fate, fell soon after at the decisive Battle of Pydna. Within mere months, both Macedonia and Illyria, the last two buffer states standing between Rome and the east, had vanished from the map. For Illyria, the devastating loss was not only political and economic, but also deeply cultural. The Romans swiftly imposed their language, currency, and established legal systems, slowly eroding the ancient tribal structures that had long defined the unique Illyrian identity. Local kings and revered warriors were replaced by Roman governors and tax collectors, while young Illyrians were increasingly conscripted into Roman auxiliary forces, fighting distant wars in lands they had never even heard of. The traditional rhythm of Illyrian life, once shaped by the changing seasons, prevailing trade winds, and deeply ingrained clan loyalties, now pulsed inexorably to the steady beat of Roman command. Yet, even in the face of crushing defeat, the indomitable spirit of Illyria lingered stubbornly. Roman generals and administrators noted that localized uprisings continued to erupt sporadically for decades, fueled by fading memories of the old kings and by defiant songs still sung of Gentius, the last monarch who had dared to stand against the seemingly invincible empire. By the time Rome officially declared the province of Illyricum, the cultural transformation was essentially complete. The Illyrian name stubbornly survived, but the independent kingdom was tragically gone forever. The rugged land of mountains and skilled sailors had become just another carefully placed stone in Rome's ever-growing mosaic of conquest, its long-cherished independence traded for the hollow and ultimately meaningless peace of total submission. Every fallen kingdom has its betrayers, and for Gentius, betrayal came not solely from his avowed enemies, but from those who had sworn oaths of friendship and promised steadfast support. When the desperate Illyrian king looked east for crucial assistance, he found Perseus of Macedon, the last of Alexander the Great's successors, whose silver tongue skillfully promised strength, unity, and unwavering resistance against the looming Roman threat. Yet, when Illyria bled and desperately needed help, Macedonia stood conspicuously idle, deliberately withholding vital support. The gold that Perseus had eagerly pledged to fund Gentius's war effort never actually arrived, and the Macedonian soldiers that Gentius expected to march north never materialized, leaving Illyria exposed and vulnerable. What had initially begun as an alliance of equals ultimately devolved into a cynical pact of convenience and deceit. According to Polybius's meticulous account, Perseus repeatedly sent envoys bearing warm words of encouragement and formally sealed agreements of mutual support, but he strategically held back crucial resources, fearing Rome's swift retaliation if Illyria failed to withstand the initial Roman onslaught. When Gentius imprisoned the Roman ambassadors, an act expressly meant to prove his unwavering loyalty to Macedonia, Perseus did absolutely nothing. He neither intervened diplomatically to de-escalate the situation nor offered any tangible military assistance, effectively leaving Gentius completely exposed to Rome's wrath. The Roman Senate quickly seized upon the incident as justification for a full-scale invasion, while Perseus callously watched from afar, selfishly hoping that Illyria would distract the legions long enough to buy him valuable time to prepare his own defenses. It was a cold and calculated gamble, and it ultimately doomed both of them. Even within Illyria, betrayal festered ominously. Certain coastal tribes, wearied by constant warfare and the heavy burden of taxation, secretly negotiated with Roman commanders, offering them strategic ports and vital supplies in exchange for lenient treatment and the promise of protection. Others, jealous of Gentius's increasingly centralized rule and resentful of his efforts to curb their autonomy, refused to send troops to bolster the Illyrian defense, further weakening the kingdom's ability to resist the invasion. The very confederation that Gentius had tirelessly tried to unify tragically fractured at the very moment when unity was most desperately needed. The Romans, masters of diplomacy and political manipulation, skillfully exploited every crack and every perceived weakness. They sent envoys offering protection and favorable terms to dissenting chieftains, strategically turning those same men into willing instruments of their own conquest. When Scadra finally fell, Gentius must have bitterly realized that his defeat was not purely a Roman victory. It was also an Illyrian, a Macedonian, and a Greek one. Betrayed by Perseus, abandoned by Greek cities that had previously promised neutrality, and fatally undermined by his own fractious tribes, he faced the end utterly and irrevocably alone. The Illyrian king had dared to dream of forging an independent and prosperous kingdom in a world increasingly dominated by powerful empires, but his purported allies had tragically chosen their own short-term survival over long-term solidarity and mutual defense. Ironically, Perseus himself would soon share Gentius's tragic fate. Captured by Rome shortly after the swift conclusion of the Illyrian campaign, the Macedonian king was ignominiously paraded through the very same streets in chains, a stark symbol of Roman power and ruthlessness. Two monarchs, one from the mountains, the other from the plains, both undone by pervasive distrust, overweening ambition, and a critical lack of foresight. In their combined downfall, Rome learned a valuable lesson that it would effectively utilize for centuries to come. Empires are not solely conquered by brute force and military might, but by skillfully breaking the bonds of trust and cooperation between those who dare to resist its relentless expansion. The final act of Illyria's tragic independence unfolded dramatically at Scadra. The city strategically cradled between the Drine and Buna rivers, and surrounded by steep hills that had long made it a formidable fortress and the undisputed seat of Illyrian kings. When the seemingly invincible Roman legions advanced under the command of the ruthless Lucius Anicius Gallus, Scadra became Gentius's last remaining hope, a final stronghold where Illyria would either valiantly endure or perish completely. Inside its imposing stone walls, the besieged king gathered his remaining forces. Weary soldiers, fiercely loyal tribal warriors, and devoted nobles who resolutely refused to abandon their embattled ruler. The urgent sound of hammers echoed loudly as blacksmiths feverishly reforged broken weapons and civilian families desperately prepared for a protracted siege. Every able-bodied man was called to arms, while women diligently carried water and tended to the wounded. For a brief and fleeting moment, a sense of unity and common purpose returned to the beleaguered city. Even those who had previously doubted Gentius and questioned his leadership now understood that the ultimate fate of Illyria hung precariously on the successful defense of this one remaining city. The Romans approached with calculated precision and methodical efficiency. Their skilled engineers constructed bridges over treacherous rivers, effectively cutting off Scadra's vital access to outside supplies, while powerful siege engines relentlessly rolled through the surrounding valleys, methodically pounding the city's defenses. They were disciplined, patient, and utterly relentless. Unlike the Illyrians, who primarily fought with passionate courage and instinct, the Roman legions advanced inexorably like a living machine, seemingly unstoppable. Yet, the determined Illyrians resisted fiercely, employing every available tactic to slow the Roman advance. Skilled archers rained down a hail of arrows from the city walls. Illyrian warriors launched daring ambushes in the surrounding ravines, and desperate night raids were organized with the intent of burning enemy camps and disrupting their supply lines. But Rome had seemingly endless time and resources, while Gentius did not. Hunger began to creep insidiously through the city as dwindling food stores rapidly diminished. The Drine River, once a vital lifeline, was now effectively blocked by vigilant Roman patrols. Disease soon followed in the wake of hunger and hardship, further weakening the already demoralized defenders. Still, Gentius resolutely refused to surrender, stubbornly clinging to the hope of a miraculous salvation. Witnesses later wrote that he moved tirelessly among his soldiers, offering words of encouragement, vowing that the proud Illyrian spirit would never die behind those stout walls. The brave defenders fought on tenaciously, even as exhaustion began to hollow out their strength and hope began to fade. Then came the inevitable breaking point. A small and understaffed Illyrian garrison guarding the crucial southern gate was suddenly overrun in a surprise Roman assault. The Roman legions relentlessly poured through the breach, quickly overwhelming the exhausted defenders. Within mere hours, the city's outer walls fell, and organized resistance tragically collapsed street by street. At dawn, Gentius appeared somberly before Anicius Gallus to negotiate terms. there would be none. The Roman commander demanded nothing less than unconditional surrender. The Illyrian king surrendered everything: his crown, his sword, and ultimately his kingdom. Scadra, the very heart of Illyria, was now irrevocably Roman. The sun set over the Drine River that evening in complete silence. The lingering smoke of battle drifted hauntingly above the surrounding hills, carrying with it the final breath of Illyrian sovereignty. A proud flame had been tragically extinguished, leaving only faint embers behind in the dusty chronicles of empire. When the dust finally settled over Scadra and the Illyrian banners were unceremoniously torn down, King Gentius vanished from the main stage of history, relegated to the footnotes of Roman annals. But his legacy, remarkably, did not entirely fade away. Although primarily remembered by Roman historians as the defeated monarch of a relatively minor kingdom to later generations of Illyrians, he became a potent symbol of fierce Illyrian defiance. The last man who dared to stand against the seemingly invincible empire that would one day rule the known world. His brief reign, though ultimately unsuccessful, marked the end of Illyria's long-cherished independence and the beginning of its gradual transformation into a vital crossroads of cultures firmly under Roman dominion. After his capture, Gentius and his family quietly faded into a life of subdued captivity in Spoletium, where they likely lived out their remaining years, closely watched but generally unharmed. Yet, his memory endured among his people, stubbornly resisting Roman efforts at cultural assimilation. The various tribes that had once followed him into battle, the Labiati, Dorsi, Dardani, and others, passed down stories and songs of the king who resolutely refused to yield to foreign oppression. In their enduring oral traditions, Gentius was not merely a ruler, but a steadfast guardian of Illyria's honor, tragically betrayed by the greed of self-serving allies and the inherent treachery of expansive empires. Rome, meanwhile, wasted no time in reshaping the conquered land that he had once ruled with such pride. The strategic Illyrian coast became an integral part of a newly created Roman administrative zone. Its bustling ports rebuilt and expanded for increased trade, and its rugged mountains actively mined for valuable silver and iron. Skilled Illyrian sailors, once branded as mere pirates, now manned Roman ships, contributing their knowledge of the Adriatic to the empire's growing naval power. Illyrian warriors filled the ranks of Roman auxiliary legions, earning widespread fame in foreign wars and contributing significantly to Rome's military strength. Ironically, the very same people who had so fiercely resisted Roman domination became instrumental in strengthening the empire that had conquered them. But beneath the seemingly smooth veneer of Roman order, the indomitable spirit of Illyrian pride tenaciously persisted. Across the generations, families meticulously traced their lineage back to the age of the kings, to Gentius, to Agron, steadfastly preserving the memory of their lost independence. Even the Romans themselves, although the ultimate victors, deeply respected the renowned toughness and resilience of the Illyrian people. Centuries later, Illyrian soldiers would rise to positions of prominence within the Roman Empire, even producing emperors of their own. Diocletian, Constantine the Great, and others whose ancestors had once sworn unwavering allegiance to Gentius's crown. Thus, the complete story of the last Illyrian king did not end solely with tragic defeat and captivity. His downfall ultimately marked not the final disappearance of his people, but their remarkable transformation and eventual resurgence within the very empire that had sought to erase them from existence. Gentius's tenacious struggle against overwhelming odds became a timeless and inspiring mirror for every small nation caught precariously between more powerful empires. An enduring echo of resistance that ultimately outlived the original conquerors themselves. Though Rome relentlessly claimed his land and sought to dominate its people, the fierce Illyrian spirit remained stubbornly unconquered, etched indelibly into the rugged mountains and forever remembered in the defiant songs of those who still proudly called that beautiful and rugged coast their beloved home.